Ocarina of Time is frequently called the greatest game ever made. It topped review aggregator lists for years, influenced an entire generation of game developers, and is consistently cited as the most important 3D game in history. But here's the uncomfortable question that needs asking. Is Ocarina of Time actually a masterpiece, or is it just nostalgia? Can a game from 1998 with dated graphics, clunky controls by modern standards, and design decisions that have been iterated upon and improved by countless subsequent games still be considered a masterpiece in 2024? Or has time passed it by, leaving only fond memories where objective greatness used to exist? Today, we're putting Ocarina of Time on trial. We're examining its strengths and weaknesses with a critical eye, comparing it both to its contemporaries and modern games, and asking the hardest question. Does Ocarina of Time hold up? Not, is it good for its time, but is it genuinely excellent by any standard? Is it a masterpiece, or is it a historically important game that we've collectively agreed to overrate out of nostalgic affection? Let's find out. Defining masterpiece. Before we can answer whether Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece, we need to define what makes something a masterpiece. Is it technical achievement, cultural impact, timeless design, influence on future works? Or is it some combination of all these factors that create something transcendent? For this analysis, let's establish clear criteria. A masterpiece should demonstrate exceptional execution of its core concepts. It should show vision and innovation beyond its contemporaries. It should create experiences that resonate emotionally and intellectually. And crucially, it should possess qualities that remain valuable regardless of when you experience it. Nostalgia can enhance appreciation, but a true masterpiece shouldn't require nostalgia to be recognized as great. With these criteria established, let's examine Ocarina of Time systematically, starting with what it objectively achieved and moving toward the more subjective question of whether those achievements constitute masterpiece status. The technical achievement. In 1998, Ocarina of Time was a technical marvel. It was one of the first games to truly nail 3D adventure gameplay, creating a fully realized 3D world that felt coherent, navigable, and alive. The Z targeting system solved camera and combat problems that plagued early 3D games. The context-sensitive action button allowed complex interactions without cluttered button layouts. The seamless transitions between exploration and combat, between indoor and outdoor areas, created immersion that was unprecedented. But here's the uncomfortable question that needs asking. Is Ocarina of Time actually a masterpiece, or is it just nostalgia? Can a game from 1998 with dated graphics, clunky controls by modern standards, and design decisions that have been iterated upon and improved by countless subsequent games still be considered a masterpiece in 2024? Or has time passed it by, leaving only fond memories where objective greatness used to exist? Today, we're putting Ocarina of Time on trial. We're examining its strengths and weaknesses with a critical eye, comparing it both to its contemporaries and modern games, and asking the hardest question. Does Ocarina of Time hold up? Not, is it good for its time, but is it genuinely excellent by any standard? Is it a masterpiece, or is it a historically important game that we've collectively agreed to overrate out of nostalgic affection? Let's find out. Defining masterpiece. Before we can answer whether Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece, we need to define what makes something a masterpiece. Is it technical achievement, cultural impact, timeless design, influence on future works? Or is it some combination of all these factors that create something transcendent? For this analysis, let's establish clear criteria. A masterpiece should demonstrate exceptional execution of its core concepts. It should show vision and innovation beyond its contemporaries. It should create experiences that resonate emotionally and intellectually. And crucially, it should possess qualities that remain valuable regardless of when you experience it. Nostalgia can enhance appreciation, but a true masterpiece shouldn't require nostalgia to be recognized as great. With these criteria established, let's examine Ocarina of Time systematically, starting with what it objectively achieved and moving toward the more subjective question of whether those achievements constitute masterpiece status. The technical achievement. In 1998, Ocarina of Time was a technical marvel. It was one of the first games to truly nail 3D adventure gameplay, creating a fully realized 3D world that felt coherent, navigable, and alive. The Z targeting system solved camera and combat problems that plagued early 3D games. The context-sensitive action button allowed complex interactions without cluttered button layouts. The seamless transitions between exploration and combat, between indoor and outdoor areas, created immersion that was unprecedented. But technical achievement alone doesn't make a masterpiece, especially when that technical achievement has been surpassed. By modern standards, Ocarina runs at 20 FPS, has a resolution that looks muddy on modern displays, and has loading times between areas that break immersion. The graphics, while charming, are objectively primitive with low polygon counts, simple textures, and minimal lighting effects. However, here's where the masterpiece argument strengthens. Ocarina's technical solutions were so elegant that they became industry standards. Z-targeting became the foundation for modern lock-on systems in countless action games. Context-sensitive buttons became universal in game design. The camera solutions Ocarina implemented are still used with only minor modifications in modern games. Technical achievement measured purely by graphical fidelity is temporary, but technical achievement measured by solving fundamental problems is permanent. Ocarina didn't just push hardware limits, it solved design problems that every 3D adventure action game faced. That's the difference between technical impressiveness and technical mastery. The former ages poorly, the latter becomes timeless because it addresses fundamental challenges rather than hardware limitations. The world design. Hyrule in Ocarina of Time is remarkably well designed for a first attempt at 3D open world structure. The world is large enough to feel expansive, but small enough to remain memorable and navigable. Each region has distinct visual identity and atmosphere. The interconnectedness creates satisfying moments of recognition when you discover shortcuts or realize how areas relate to each other. NPCs are sparse and mostly serve functional purposes rather than creating a living world. Compared to modern open worlds, Ocarina's Hyrule feels limited, constrained, and somewhat lifeless. But here's the counter-argument. Ocarina's world design prioritizes quality over quantity. Every location serves a purpose. There's minimal filler content. The world is carefully crafted to guide exploration without explicitly telling players where to go. Modern open worlds are larger, but often padded with repetitive content, map markers, and busy work that dilutes the experience. Ocarina's smaller, denser approach means every area matters and nothing feels disposable. The world design also demonstrates remarkable restraint. Nintendo could have made Hyrule feel larger to impress with scale, but they sized it precisely to create appropriate pacing between locations. They could have filled every corner with enemies and collectibles, but they left space for atmosphere and anticipation. This restraint is a mark of maturity in design that many modern games lack. The time travel mechanic elevates world design from good to exceptional. Seeing how Hyrule changes between child and adult timelines creates emotional investment in the world. Locations gain narrative depth through transformation. The world becomes a character in itself, capable of evoking joy, nostalgia, and sadness depending on when you visit locations. This emotional geography is sophisticated world design that many modern games still struggle to achieve. The dungeon design. Ocarina's dungeons are frequently cited as some of the best in gaming, and this claim holds up remarkably well. Each dungeon has a distinct identity, unique mechanics, and clever puzzles that require spatial reasoning and creative problem solving. The dungeons teach you their logic language and then test whether you've internalized it. They reward observation and experimentation without excessive handholding.
The Forest Temple's twisted reality and haunting atmosphere. The Fire Temple's verticality and use of time mechanics. The Water Temple's infamous complexity requiring careful attention to water levels and navigation. The Shadow Temple's genuine horror elements and invisible maze. Each dungeon commits fully to its theme and mechanics, creating memorable experiences that players remember decades later. Critics point to the Water Temple as evidence of design failure, and there's validity to this. The Water Temple's complexity crosses from challenging to frustrating for many players, with backtracking and menu management that feels tedious rather than intellectually satisfying. But is one divisive dungeon enough to disqualify masterpiece status? Especially when that same dungeon is praised by other players as the pinnacle of Zelda puzzle design? The dungeon structure itself, find the map, find the compass, collect small keys, get the dungeon item, use that item to access new areas, fight the mini-boss, get the boss key, defeat the boss, became a template that Zelda games followed for decades. This structure works because it creates clear progression milestones while allowing flexibility in how you achieve them. Modern dungeons in other games often follow variations of this template because Ocarina proved it works. What elevates Ocarina's dungeons to masterpiece level is how they integrate combat, puzzles, exploration, and atmosphere into cohesive experiences. They're not just puzzle boxes or combat arenas, they're complete challenges that test every skill you've developed. The best modern dungeons still follow this holistic approach because Ocarina demonstrated it was the ideal structure. The combat system. Ocarina's combat is simple by modern standards. Lock on, watch for openings, strike, defend, repeat. Enemy variety is limited. Most encounters use similar strategies. Boss fights, while spectacular, often boil down to learning patterns and exploiting obvious weak points. Compared to modern action games with complex combo systems, parrying mechanics, and diverse movesets, Ocarina's combat feels basic. But simplicity isn't inherently a weakness. Ocarina's combat is accessible and readable. You always understand what's happening and why you succeeded or failed. The Z-targeting system ensures the camera never becomes your real enemy. The combat serves the game's purpose, creating satisfying victories without demanding fighting game execution without overcomplicating itself. The swordsmanship has weight and impact despite simple mechanics. Landing hits feels substantial. The sound design of combat creates visceral satisfaction. Different enemies require different approaches, not through complex mechanics, but through pattern recognition and timing. It's combat that prioritizes clarity and fairness over complexity. Is this masterpiece-level combat? Not when evaluated purely on mechanical depth. Games like Devil May Cry, God of War, and even later Zelda games have more sophisticated combat systems. But masterpiece status doesn't require being the absolute best in every category. It requires excellence in service of a larger vision, and Ocarina's combat accomplishes exactly what it needs without becoming a distraction or barrier to the adventure. The story and characters. Ocarina's narrative is straightforward. Chosen hero must collect spiritual stones, then awaken sages, then defeat evil king. It's a classic hero's journey without major twists or complex themes. The dialogue is minimal. Link is silent, and most character development happens through environmental storytelling rather than explicit narrative. Yet, Ocarina's story works because of how it's integrated into gameplay. The time travel creates inherent narrative drama. Watching Hyrule fall into darkness because you pulled the Master Sword too soon is more emotionally impactful than lengthy cutscenes could achieve. The story of growing up, losing innocence, and accepting responsibility emerges naturally from the game structure rather than being told at you. The characters, despite limited screen time and dialogue, are memorable. Zelda's transformation from child princess to Sheik to adult ruler creates a complete character arc. Saria represents the childhood you can never return to. Ganondorf is menacing for presence rather than exposition. Even minor characters like the Skull Kid or the Carpenter's Son have personality that makes them stick in memory. The ending sequence, defeating Ganondorf, sealing Ganon, and being sent back to childhood, creates genuine melancholy. You saved the world, but lost everything you experienced. The relationships you formed don't exist. The growth you achieved is erased. It's bittersweet in a way that respects player intelligence and emotional sophistication. How many games from 1998 trusted their audience with emotionally complex endings? The music. Koji Kondo's soundtrack is objectively brilliant and is rarely disputed. Every track is memorable. The music enhances atmosphere perfectly. The Ocarina songs becoming gameplay mechanics creates unique integration of music and game systems. This is one area where Ocarina's masterpiece status is almost universally acknowledged. The music also demonstrates timeless quality. Unlike graphics or game mechanics that age with technology, good music remains good indefinitely. Hearing Zelda's Lullaby or the Song of Storms today evokes the same emotional response it did in 1998. The soundtrack is so strong that it's been performed by orchestras worldwide and remains iconic decades later. The influence and legacy. Ocarina of Time's influence on game development is undeniable. It established templates for 3D action-adventure games that remain standard today. Z-targeting, context-sensitive actions, dungeon structure, overworld navigation, countless games use systems that Ocarina pioneered or perfected. It proved that complex 3D adventures could work on consoles and influenced everything from God of War to Dark Souls to modern open-world games. But influence doesn't automatically equal masterpiece. Important and masterpiece are different categories. Something can be historically significant without being artistically transcendent. The question isn't whether Ocarina influenced games, it's whether Ocarina itself achieves excellence beyond its historical importance. The dated elements. Let's honestly address Ocarina's weaknesses and dated elements. The frame rate is low and occasionally drops further. The resolution is muddy, text scrolls slowly. The camera, despite Z-targeting, still has frustrating moments in tight spaces.
Some dungeons have excessive backtracking. Navi's interruptions genuinely annoy. The owl's unskippable dialogue is tedious. Certain puzzles rely on unclear logic or pixel hunting. These aren't minor nitpicks, they're legitimate design issues that affect the experience. Modern games have solved these problems, and playing Ocarina after experiencing those solutions can be frustrating. The 3DS remake addressed many of these issues, which somewhat proves they were problems worth fixing. Does having flaws disqualify something from being a masterpiece? Not necessarily. Many acknowledged masterpieces in other mediums have flaws. Perfect execution isn't required for masterpiece status, but the overall achievement must transcend individual weaknesses. The question is whether Ocarina's strengths are significant enough to overshadow its limitations. The nostalgia factor. This is the elephant in the room. How much of Ocarina's reputation is deserved excellence versus nostalgic affection? For millions of players, Ocarina was their first 3D adventure, their introduction to Zelda, or their defining N64 experience. These emotional connections are powerful and valid, but they complicate objective evaluation. The nostalgia question goes both ways. Nostalgia can cause overrating games that don't hold up, but it can also help us recognize what made something special in the first place. Sometimes the emotional response you had at age 10 is actually a valid recognition of genuine quality, not a childish misunderstanding. The challenge is separating legitimate appreciation from rose-tinted revisionism. Here's a useful test. People who play Ocarina for the first time today with no nostalgic attachment often still rate it highly. Not universally, some find it too dated to enjoy, but many recognize the quality design, satisfying progression, and emotional storytelling despite aged presentation. This suggests Ocarina has merit beyond nostalgia, even if nostalgia enhances appreciation for those who experienced it originally. The modern comparison. Compared to modern games, Ocarina is smaller, simpler, and more constrained. Breath of the Wild gives players far more freedom. Modern action games have more complex combat. Contemporary RPGs have deeper stories. Technical presentation has improved exponentially. In direct feature comparisons, Ocarina often loses to modern equivalents. But Ocarina isn't trying to compete with modern games on their terms. It's a product of its era that excels within its constraints. Judging it by modern standards is useful for understanding how design has evolved, but isn't the only valid evaluation method. A 1940s film noir doesn't need CGI to be a masterpiece. A 1960s rock album doesn't need modern production to be brilliant. Context matters. The better comparison is asking, does Ocarina demonstrate mastery of its own possibilities? Does it achieve excellence within its constraints? Does it show vision, craft, and emotional intelligence? By these standards, Ocarina succeeds. It doesn't just do what was possible in 1998, it does what was possible in 1998 nearly perfectly.
The verdict, masterpiece or not? So after all this analysis, is Ocarina of Time a masterpiece? The answer is nuanced. Yes, but with caveats. Ocarina is a masterpiece of game design in its era. It solved fundamental 3D action-adventure problems elegantly, created memorable experiences through careful craft, and achieved emotional resonance that transcends technical limitations. It demonstrates vision, restraint, and sophistication in design that many modern games lack despite superior resources. However, calling it the greatest game ever made or a perfect game is overstatement. It has legitimate flaws, dated elements, and areas where subsequent games improved upon its formula. Its reputation has been somewhat inflated by nostalgia and by being evaluated primarily against 1998 standards rather than universal standards. The most accurate assessment is this: Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece of its type and era that retains substantial value today. It's not perfect, not universally superior to all games, and not immune to criticism, but it achieves a level of craft, vision, and emotional impact that justifies its reputation as one of gaming's most important and accomplished works. If you've never played it and wonder whether it's worth experiencing today, the answer depends on your tolerance for older games. If you can appreciate design excellence despite dated presentation, Ocarina absolutely holds up. If you need modern conveniences and production values to enjoy games, you'll struggle with it. But the design itself, the dungeons, the world structure, the progression, the emotional storytelling remains excellent by any standard. The final word. Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece, but not because it's perfect. It's a masterpiece because it represents a moment where vision, craft, and technology aligned to create something that pushed boundaries, solved problems, and created experiences that resonated deeply with millions of players. It's a masterpiece because it demonstrated possibilities that influenced decades of game development. And it's a masterpiece because, despite its age and limitations, it still offers something valuable to players willing to meet it on its own terms. Can something be a masterpiece while also being flawed, dated, and surpassed in various ways by subsequent works? Absolutely. That's what makes masterpiece status interesting rather than simple. Ocarina of Time earned its reputation through achievement, not nostalgia, even if nostalgia enhances that reputation for those who experienced it in its era. So yes, Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece. Not a perfect masterpiece, not an unquestionable masterpiece, but a legitimate masterpiece that deserves its place in gaming history. And honestly, that's a more interesting answer than simple yes or no could ever be.